Hey, welcome back to Zombie Tactics, today with another installment in the GunFu series. And I'm going to call this, I don't even know what the title is going to be, something like The Compressed Skill Set. That'll be really boring. But here's what I'm talking about today. This is going to be one of those videos where you're going to say, what the hell's he talking about? But hopefully it'll be interesting enough to enough people. I've been shooting guns for a little over 3 decades, and I've been seriously training with various companies for about the past 4 or 5. Taken several hundred hours of formal training from various companies. I think the last time I added it up, if I really add it all up, all the training that I've taken in a lifetime, it probably comes to over 1,000 hours of actual training. That's not counting, just range time or me out shooting tin cans someplace, but actual training where there's an instructor and he knows what he's doing and you're going to learn something from him about firearms or shooting or something. So somewhere around 1,000 hours lifelong, many hundreds in the past few years. And one of the things that you often encounter if you train with a lot of companies is Company A is undoubtedly, their instructor is an authority and their methodologies are undoubtedly something that works because they keep getting repeat business from all the right people and they've been there and done that enough themselves to know what they think works and what doesn't work. And the problem is you've also got Company B and C and D and others, and they've all got their own little ways of doing things. And everybody, to some degree or another, insists that either their way is the best way, or it's the best way that they've found, or they'll be, courteous enough and humble enough to say, well, we're teaching you a way, not necessarily the way, but please check this out because we really think that we've got it nailed down. That still puts you in a position where you have to say, all right, I've got to find a way to choose what works for me. And just the way I think about these things, I'm going to digress for a little bit and tell you kind of the package that I put around this in terms of thinking about firearms technique, and specifically firearms technique and manipulations for the purpose of self-defense, because I think that context is always important. I think a military context or a SWAT team type context, things operate differently enough there that all the same things that work in those kinds of environments and might not really work for us as an individual citizen having to defend ourselves or our loved ones. So we can't automatically think that what works in that world works in our world. Here's the way I've been thinking about it, though. If I look at other areas of human development, I notice a few trends. One of them is that if people want to get really good at something, they try to do things the same way over and over again consistently. So consistency is a big deal. So if we're going to shoot a basketball, hit a baseball, if we're going to manufacture a piece of equipment, one of the things we try to do is we make sure that we try to do the same thing the same way every time and to do it consistently. And that we do that even if we know that we're not at the end of a process of figuring out what all the best techniques are. It's almost like it's more important to get it consistent from the beginning and then make small changes to find out what's the best than it is to try to figure out what is the best and then get it consistent. And that's exactly the way that it works, for instance, in things like Deming total quality management or Kaizen management theory for companies making products. They will say, all right, the first thing we need to do is make the manufacturing of our product consistent so that every product that comes off the line is exactly the same. We want that consistency in our product to be the first thing. Deming was giving an example of this once, and he said, when you make an inconsistent product, what that says to people is that you don't know what you're doing. You get one teacup, because he's talking to the Japanese, that comes off the line that's a perfect work of art, and the next one's not so good, and the next one's maybe garbage, and the next one is kind of good. And all that tells people, if they open up a box of your teacups, is you guys are confused and you don't know what the hell's going on. He actually told companies that they would be better off if they made a flawed teacup that was flawed in exactly the same way with every single one that opened up the box. He went so far as to say that if you opened up the box and each one had precisely the same size, same shaped chip in exactly the same place on every teacup, that people would actually think of that as an extremely high quality product just because, wow, they're chipped in precisely the same way on every cup. It's like they meant to do this. It's like weird and unusual and different, and so now we want these teacups that are perfectly chipped. So even though there's a flaw, the fact that they get it perfect every time and get it consistent every time Now they can start working on things like, oh, now let's work on getting that chip worked out of the process. We've got it 100% consistent. Now we can start working on making it better. And one of the other ways they make things better is by trying to figure out ways to simplify processes. So if it currently takes 19 different steps to make, I don't know, a golf ball, if we can reduce that down to 10 steps and still make golf balls of reasonably about the same quality, then we're overall improving the quality of the product because we've removed the number of things that can go wrong. We have fewer things to manage in a business, for instance. And this is exactly the kind of thing that's behind processes like lean management techniques and lean manufacturing principles. We try to find a way that we can simplify the number of steps, the number of tools, and the number of people that we need to manufacture a product, because now we have fewer things to manage, and it's easier for us to manage fewer things than it is stuff that's just flying all over the place. So even though we may have great quality, we're going to try and bring consistency and a smaller set of tools together to do that same thing, because it makes the overall business easier to manage, and it actually improves product quality and profitability and all that kind of stuff, as an aside. Now, I know people are already going, oh, what the hell is he talking about? I promise this will be over soon. Now, we also get this principle in other areas as well. There's something called reduced instruction set computing, and the theory behind that is you can take a microprocessor that is theoretically not operating as fast, but if you give it a reduced set of instructions, it may be able to outperform a computer chip that has a greater set of instructions in it, that it knows how to do more things. Theoretically, this ought to be always, always, always faster and better because it knows how to do more things by itself without having to write any special software. It has more stuff built in. But even though this one doesn't, we can actually make it operate faster overall because it has fewer things to manage. And that theory actually turns out to be true. Reduced instruction set computing is faster and more efficient than the way other microprocessors are built with more instructions built into them. Now, there are reasons why RISC computing hasn't caught on in the marketplace, and we use this other kind of computing architecture currently, at least in our, our home computers and things like that. But RISC as a theory does work out wherever it's tried, and whenever there's an apples to apples comparison, the RISC architecture always wins out. And that's because it has a reduced number of instructions that it just does so fast and so well that it outdoes something that looks like it's a better process or a more capable thing. Now, throwing this all together, this is exactly what I'm trying to do in developing what I call my own personal GunFu. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy out there taking some firearms training, learning to do things the best I can, bringing it all together and saying, all right, how am I going to take all this information and figure out what works for me? Well, what works for me is I'm trying to do exactly that. I'm first of all trying to gain consistency in what I do so that every time the gun comes out of the holster, it's coming out of the holster exactly the same way. Every time I load the gun or reload the gun, I'm going to do it exactly the same way. Every time I have to do some kind of malfunction clearance or anything else with that gun or that firearm, whether it's a rifle, a shotgun, anything, for that particular weapon type, I'm going to try and do it exactly the same way every time, because that's the way that I'm going to gain proficiency with it. The other thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out what is the smallest subset of skills that will work to fit all the most likely, most probable things that the plausible circumstances that I'm likely to encounter where I'll have to use a gun to defend myself or someone under my care. Because if I can reduce the number of things that I have to learn, then overall I'm increasing the efficiency of the entire system, meaning my personal GunFu system or whatever kind of crazy thing that you want to use to it. Now that concept's a little weird, so I'll kind of explain to you what I'm doing. So what's an example of the kind of thing that I'm working about? I've already talked about I'm going to present the gun the same way every time. I'm going to do everything the same way every time. Well, what do I do when I have choices about the way to do things? For instance, if I've got the slide locked back on a gun like this, meaning that it's empty, and I've dropped the magazine, I'm then going to stick another magazine in there, and we're not talking about magazine inserts right now. We're talking about the part that we're going to work after this. I got a couple of different things I can do. One of them is I can either drop the slide using my thumb And that works really fast, and that's great whenever I can do that. If that's something that I can do in the middle of a gunfight or a self-defense incident, that's exactly what I ought to do. If I'm loading the gun elsewise, though, I'm not really doing anything. Like if I'm just doing a reload, a tactical reload or topping off the gun, you'd say, well, I'm not doing anything. The magazine just goes in there, right? Because I think there's already a bullet in there. Well, some guns don't work that way very well, meaning that if the slide is locked back and I put a magazine in there, getting to this button here might not work with this thumb. I might need to use the support thumb instead. And other guns altogether, like Ruger SR9C, this little thing here is very difficult to operate. So in terms of consistency and reducing the skill set that I have to train with for the various guns that I work with, it's better for me to say, all right, anytime that I am loading my gun, anytime that I'm putting a magazine in here, whether it's a slide lock reload or whatever kind it is, I'm going to reach up here and I'm going to rack the slide. Not because that's necessarily the fastest. I know for a fact, because I've had it demonstrated to me by people who are much better shooters and much more skilled than I am, and I've tested it for myself. It's a fact that whenever you can get to that slide release and just do that, that's faster. There's no question about that. It's always faster by about a quarter second or so. So we're not talking about necessarily what's faster, but what I have done is I've reduced the number of things that I have to practice by one thing. Now, instead of having to practice this and this, all I have to practice is this. And by the way, this is the same thing that I do if I have a stovepipe to get the gun into condition. This is the same thing that I have to do if I have a failure to feed. If I have a double feed or a feedway stoppage issue here, a type 3 malfunction, one of the first things I'm going to have to do is rip the magazine out of the gun somehow or another and rack. So this whole thing here of racking the slide, I'm doing that more times than I'm doing anything else, and it solves a whole lot of problems. So even though I'm going to say, well, I know that there's a marginal superiority to dropping the slide like that, I'm going to go ahead and in my own training and in my own personal GunFu, every single time that a magazine goes in the gun, the slide gets pulled back. Because that's a way to apply these principles, the same kinds of principles that work in Deming quality management and Kaizen management and lean manufacturing and risk computing and all this kind of other stuff. If those principles work in every other area of life, if they work in sports, if they work in business, if they work in anything else that we can think about, there's no reason to think that they shouldn't work in firearms as well to increase our own skill level. So that's the reason why I'm applying that principle. Now, I realize that things happen like this. If I'm in the middle of a gunfight and the slide is locked back and I put the gun in, and I put this magazine in and I slam it home and I realize in the middle of a gunfight, oh, I can just do that with my thumb, then fine, I'm home free. If a cognitive event happens that allows me to think it through, and I can realize that I can get an advantage by doing that, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm just not necessarily going to take all of my time practicing that thing. I'm going to try and practice the things that constitute the smallest subset of skills that are useful for all the circumstances that I'm going to encounter, and then maybe spend a little bit of time practicing those things that, if I can cognitively get there, they confer me an advantage. Same kind of thing here. I'm not even sure here if I can do it or not. This works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times on Glocks and some other guns, if you slide this in here forcefully enough, you'll be able to get the gun. Ah, there we go. You'll be able to get the slide to go all by itself just by inserting the magazine. Happy that that happened. That doesn't happen all the time with this gun. But I'm not going to base my survival on practicing this technique over and over and over to the point where I can get it to some kind of, well, it works 80% of the time efficiency. That's not a way to bet my life. That's not something to bet my life on. Instead, I'm just going to, if that happens and I recognize it, I'm going to go, oh, cool. The slide went home. I don't have to do anything with it right now. I can just continue going bang, bang, bang now. There's not an issue, with that. But if I don't recognize something, like say for instance, if I'm in the middle of a gunfight and I did slide that home and it did, I'm just going to go ahead and let it go, pretend it happened this time. if I don't recognize that, well, my hand is already automatically going up here and racking the slide. And sure, what's going to happen? I didn't realize that the slide had already racked itself, and now I eject it around. In the grand scheme of things, that's not going to be the thing that's going to cost me my life. What was important in that moment is that I actually got a gun that I knew was capable of being fired. How I got there is not important, as long as that was something that was certain and hopefully nearly instinctive, and probably the smallest set of skills that I can possibly practice that covers all the bases. Because that way I can take the amount of practice time that I have available and use it more efficiently. If I have 20 different things to practice, that means that my practice time is divided 20 different ways. All it means is that I'm 1/20th as sucky at one thing as I do at everything else. It's like when they talk about people who are ambidextrous. Ambidextrous people are not as good with both hands as people who are right-handed. It's not like you have two right hands. It's like you have two left hands now. You're kind of almost equally as bad with both hands until you do a lot of work to fix that problem. I don't want to have my practice time divided against all kinds of, a long list of things that are supposedly the perfect ways to do things. I think my practice time is better spent by saying, let's take this list of 20 things, maybe move it down to 5. Now I am 5 times more, I have 5 times more time to practice every single one of those things. And in the grand scheme, I think that that actually is going to increase my efficiency and my ability to run the gun under a stressful circumstance. That's just GunFu theory. I don't know what I'm going to title the video yet, but that's Zombie Tactics GunFu. Call it whatever you like. It's not supposed to be some thing that I'm going to trademark or whatever. That's it for today. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.